I'm very pleased now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. John Farrington. John, wherever you are, would you please join us? There are very, very few people in the world who have the experience, the history, and certainly the perspective as our plenary speaker, John. John has been part of GoMRI since the very beginning. He's an esteemed member of the research board. He's a dean emeritus at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. He's been working with the oil spill science community since the West Falmouth spill back in 1969. And best of all, John and I are great friends. He and I were involved in, I don't even want to say how long ago, in Oil in the Sea, Roman numeral II at the National Academy of Science, where we kind of sparred, but we remained great friends. So John, it's wonderful to have you. It's an honor to have you here to speak. And at the conclusion of John's talk, we'll have some questions, but let me remind you to use the index cards on your tables and raise them in the air so that they can be picked up. John, I look forward to hearing you. And we're going to go forward and hear you from the audience.
Well, Rita, I'm honored by that very nice introduction. And I must say that I'm very honored to have an opportunity to share a few comments with you today, and they're going to be relatively few. The first thing I'd like to start with is, oops, we're getting things overlapped here, up here anyway, a remembrance. And we've talked about that already. Whenever I give a talk with respect to oil pollution that has anything to do with the Deepwater Horizon, I start with this slide. I have a disclaimer. This is my presentation. It's not endorsed by the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative people, nor the research board, or anybody else. However, after I finish, endorsements are welcome. In the introduction, I want to set the scene. I'm then going to go through a little bit of past. I'm going to do a few examples from GoMRI and some lessons for the future. I need to acknowledge all the people involved in the GoMRI family. It's been a wonderful pleasure to be involved in interacting with all of you, colleagues on the research board, individuals in the staff, students and postdocs who've been involved in various places, and all of the people in the various GoMRI programs, consortia, small group, individual PIs. It's been fun, really. And I want to thank especially our two previous speakers, Ellen Williams and Rita Caldwell, for the invitation to join. Thank you very much. I think it's pretty clear that we all in this room owe you a great deal of thanks. The two most important lessons that I've taken away from oil spill research, and you might be surprised by this, is the fact that there needs to be a continued and increased and intense focus on safety. We don't want people hurt, we don't want people killed, and at the same time, we want to prevent oil spills to the best we can. And it's a challenging task, it's a very dangerous environment that people work in. It's very advanced technology. We do the best we can, but we're all human. And as I think as Professor Williams has pointed out in her brief remarks here, unfortunately, we're probably going to face some of these accidents in the future. And so we need to learn, and we need to bring the best information and the best minds and the best science to this particular problem. But keep in mind, safety and prevention, those are our strongest goals. Now, a few lessons from the past. It's So I dug through my files in my office, and I came up with a whole bunch of things, and of course I don't have any time to share all of them, but one of them I thought was particularly interesting. From the coast of Louisiana in 1935, Paul Gotzoff and the individuals in the Bureau of Commercial Fisheries were asked to take a look at the question of the nearshore environment and the oil slicks that were there and oil in the environment, and some question about contamination and killing of oysters. It's a wonderful report, and you can Google it and find it, and I highly recommend taking a look at it because it has some very interesting lessons for us. For example, what did they do? They took a look at these areas, names familiar, especially to those in Louisiana. And what did they do? They did field observations, and they did lab experiments. And they did them with oysters, and they did them with phytoplankton. Field observations, lab experiments. The only thing missing in this is mesocosms. It should sound familiar to us. They set the scene for the types of things that we would do. And there are many others who did research things like that. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the spill Tampico, Maru. Raise your hand. Few. Excellent. 64 kilometers south of Ensenada in the Baja, California. It was a dark diesel oil. It was a barge. It went aground at the head area of a cove. The oil all went ashore. And within a few months, maybe a few weeks, a professor by the name of Wheeler J. North, who had been educated at Caltech and at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, he was a biological oceanographer at that time, went down there and started to look at the biology. And he followed it for many, many, many years. Unfortunately, in those days, it was difficult to get papers published in the peer-reviewed scientific journals that had to do with oil pollution. So he presented the papers at various international conferences in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was a principal participant in the first Petroleum in the Marine Environment and Oil in the Sea of the National Academy. He brought the very best, at that time, cutting-edge biological oceanography and ecology to the study of the effects. Now, of course, we have this Torrey Canyon wake-up call. We fast forward here. Everybody, I think, who's involved in oil pollution research now has read something about the Torrey Canyon, but I recommend you look through the 2017 International Oil Spill Conference proceedings, and there's a paper in there about 50 years retrospective looking at the Torrey Canyon. It was a wake-up call. One of the most important things that came out of that, an unfortunate thing, is that they tried to use every kind of chemical, cleaner, detergent, you name it, and they called it dispersant. And this is where, as far as I can discern, dispersant's got a bad name. We also learned that the Royal Air Force tried to bomb the slick. That didn't work either. There were some other notable spills for a variety of reasons. The Union Oil Company spill off of California and the Santa Barbara oil spill in '69. Later that year, the barge Florida, a much smaller spill, 600,000 liters of number 2 fuel oil, came thundering ashore in West Falmouth, Massachusetts, which happens to be the shoreline where lots of scientists at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution were living. And they brought cutting edge, at that time, biological oceanography like Wheeler North had done, with the addition of cutting edge analytical chemistry and geochemistry. And so from that, and from the Arrow incident in Chedabucto Bay, which happened in 1970, the same cutting-edge biology of our colleagues in Canada, cutting-edge geochemistry and knowledge of the ocean and the coastal area, we began to build up a sense of what it is we needed to know. So crude oil spill, number 2 fuel oil spill, bunker spill. 3 different environments. So quickly we began to understand that the type of oil and the type of environment made a very big difference. And we also understood the lesson that we've heard here carried forward in the discussion between Professor Caldwell and Professor Williams. Cutting edge science, bring it to the problem. It works. And then there was the IXTOC well. I had the pleasure of going on that cruise as a senior chemist. It was because oil was coming ashore in Texas, even though the spill was in the Bay of Campeche. We had a cruise on the researcher and the contract vessel Pierce. There was no physical oceanography allowed on the cruise for a variety of reasons. No biological effects studies were allowed. That's because we were going into the exclusive economic zone of Mexico. And they said, don't want that. So we could do chemistry and biogeochemistry, some hydrographic stations, and we could also do microbial studies. I've been asked, why is it that some individuals have said at the time, the early days of the Deepwater Horizon, well, there were no peer-reviewed scientific publications from IXTOC. That's not true. I invite you to go on Web of Science and look up from 1979 up to about 1983. And yeah, there are not a lot of papers. There are 14. There are 2 of them in environmental science and technology and 1 of them in Nature. Those aren't shabby journals. Okay, and the reason there weren't any more is because at that time, the headquarters people in NOAA in Washington, D.C. said, everybody has to publish the stuff in the proceedings of this conference. And we all did that. And at that time, wow, the oil spill had been shut off. Okay, we're done. Unlike the present situation that we're talking about. And kudos to BP, I say, and the Gulf of Mexico Alliance for making sure that this research is ongoing. And now we have the Gulf Research Program, the Academy, we have the Centers of Excellence. It's great. And then there was the Exxon Valdez. And I happened to be there only because I was the chair of a National Research Council committee that was reviewing the Environmental Studies Program. And we happened to be reviewing aspects of the program that had to do with, do we have adequate information for leasing in certain areas? And that group reported to a cabinet-level task force of President George H.W. Bush. And so I was able to, I was invited and I got a ride. It was on the first day they started cleaning up, helicopter ride out there. And some of the lessons I took away, anyway, from that spill, and of course there are a plethora of peer-reviewed papers out there, which is great. And we've built on that in the Deepwater Horizon. So here are a few of hundreds of lessons I took away. Uh-oh. So hot water cleaning of the rocks and the sand, probably not a good idea. Okay, it was a good idea at the time. I'll tell you, there's tremendous pressure for people to do something. That was the whole issue, do something. So then the question came up, all right, so you're doing this, but what's the ultimate objective? In fact, I asked that question on the shoreline there, and I got kind of a blank look from state agency and some of the federal agency people who were there. So I shouted above the helicopter noises, how clean is clean? And finally I got an answer on that. But that brought up the issue. How clean is clean when we respond to spills? And it's a very interesting question. I think it's still there with us today. Hopefully some of the research in the GoMRI program will tell us that. This was the first of the natural resource damage assessment applications in a large scale. And so I found it very interesting that even though our group reported to President George H.W. Bush's task force and cabinet that we weren't allowed to see the NOAA data. And then the fate and effects debate continues 30 years later. So we can fully expect that 30 years from now, there will be people sitting in conference rooms like this at oil spill conferences or elsewhere talking about reinterpretation of the data and the findings of GoMRI, and that's a great thing. So what are some truths? Very quickly, marine ecosystems are a complex soup. Physical and chemical and biological, geological processes. Petroleum is a complex mixture of chemicals. The challenge is you stir this into the soup, and you ask the question in minutes to decades, what are the fates and effects of the petroleum chemicals? The fates, millimeters to 1,000 kilometers, the effects from subcellular and lethal up to sublethal on the scales of biological organization. You can think of it from microbes to whales, if you will. Add some seasoning to this marine ecosystems oil mixture soup. Dispersants. We have a complex challenge in space and time, very complex. Especially since we know that, as I said before, different oils have different compositional mixtures and we're dealing with different ecosystems. So early on in my career when I was dealing with this, I got some advice. You can't go through life applying Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to everything. Even though there's a complex mixture and so forth, we need to work on this. If the first cave people came out of the cave, looked around and said life is complex and went back into the cave, we wouldn't be here. So even though it's complex, we need to pick away at it in different ways. Now, we have a simplified diagram here. I know others have their favorite way of doing this. I can happen to use this because I was one of the co-authors, so I didn't need to get permission to use this slide. What we're doing here is we're drawing something in a cartoon way, but we really want to get it is in a numerical modeling type approach. Now, with due credit to Sid Harris, I'd like to show this cartoon, which is a systems model approach. And the pointer there says, okay, good work, but I think we might need just a little more detail right here, which is the part, well, then a miracle occurs. Okay. Now that slide's been used in a number of different places. I have the Farrington adaptation for the Sid Harris cartoon right here. Great work, GoMRI. However, we need to find a way to continue to make progress. So we're ongoing. We're moving from descriptive to semi-quantitative to quantitative. So one of the questions that I ask is, what's an adequate baseline? We've heard people talk about, gee, we wish we had an adequate baseline. Well, back in 1974, February 2nd, across the bay in St. Petersburg, there was a conference finishing up. It was the beginning of asking the scientific community, how should we go about doing research and assessments in the Minerals Management Service, which was then called the BLM program. Okay, it was at the Institute of Oceanography, State University System of Florida. Now we have USF over there in St. Petersburg, our marine science colleagues. One of the principal questions that came out of the conference, 1974, adequate baselines. People could not come to agreement on adequate baselines. I challenged the GoMRI folks here, the investigators and the teams that they have. Can we actually come up with what's an adequate baseline? And there are a number of things we need to think about. Human health, which is what we've heard about, of course. the very important part. I would suggest to colleagues in biological oceanography the fact that marine organisms live in a complex chemical soup. They interact with pheromones or chemotaxis, depending on how you look at it. Do we have any indications? I think there was, Chuck, something like 14 papers now out of the GoMRI effort on pheromones and chemotaxis. But we should be doing more. That's just one suggestion out of many. So what are the important lessons? I've given you a couple there. I'm going to punt on this and say, stay tuned for the panels and the presentations that follow, because these folks will do a much better job of it than I could. We need to communicate to the elected and appointed officials. Always a challenge. Back when I was a graduate student, this was the Sid Harris cartoon we were given. For those who can't read it, these are the equations the professor at the board saying to the general public person, but this is the simplified version for the greater public. Well, we have a plethora of different ways of communicating, and we've mentioned a few of those, and with all apologies to all of the folks who've done excellent things, I can only pick one of the, because I have the time, and so I picked this one, Bob the Drifter. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about Bob the Drifter later on. And I didn't know that when I put this together. Knowledge, our legacy. Knowledge, data. On the way down in the plane, I was reviewing a paper for a journal. The data came from Grid C. Nothing else. The people were using the Grid C data. That's great. We have education and outreach materials. We have the challenge that we've gotten started on thanks to Bert Singer, Paul Sandifer, Rita and the group that have talked about public health concerns. That's one of our big legacies. I would submit to you that we have a major challenge. How to bring the knowledge and lessons to the coastal developing countries worldwide, because they face a lot of the challenges that we've talked about. Whether it's from offshore oil and gas production, whether it's from tanker traffic, whether it's from chronic releases on the shoreline. How can we get the message out to them? Can we gather them somewhere in a room like this and talk with them about our lessons? I think we can all say the research board is very proud of the legacy of the students, the postdocs, and the early career scientists, the GoMRI family of consortia, and individuals and small group PIs. Let me speak to the early career scientists for a moment, please. When I started off, the effort and emphasis, and it was legitimate and it still is, focus on basic research, John, focus on basic research. But I learned that working on various aspects of oil pollution problems and PCBs and other things was equally gratifying. And in fact, I learned lessons from that research that were relevant to the basic research and so forth. And along the way, I was helped by colleagues who were just interested in solving particular problems on a day-to-day basis. For example, the engineers at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution producing particular types of instruments that we could use. So there's this dynamic of different careers that people can go into. The academic career, and then they used to talk about, and it was a stupid thing to say, alternate careers. Stupid is my explanation. There are careers in NGOs, there are careers in the private sector, there are careers in government labs, there are a variety of careers in teaching or in universities, and I could go on and on. The interaction is what's important. And people move back and forth, which is equally important. And I would submit to you that the most important thing that we can do is to honor each other's contributions. Okay, we're going to debate scientific points. That's how science proceeds. Ask a question, debate, say, no, I disagree, and have a comeback. But do it in an honorable fashion. Respect each other's contributions. Thank you.
Absolutely. You're right on time. Well, thank you very much, John. That was wonderful. And if you have any questions of John, please fill out the cards and raise your hand, and a staff member will come grab them and try and get them up here. But John, I have a question for you. Matter of fact, I have two if we don't get any questions. Will big data help to put the various disciplinary data into a cohesive understanding and allow better and more efficient appreciation of the ecosystem and the associated physical and chemical effects?
Right, I think it will. I think it's an interesting challenge, and I had in my original talk preparation 2 slides to illustrate the point, actually 3. I had one of the satellite imagery of the Gulf of Mexico and circulation and the Gulf Loop current and all of the eddies going around and that sort of thing. And my next slide was a 2-dimensional gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis of oil with all of the little dots in there that people like me understand what they mean and what the concentration is, but I'm sure colleagues, in fact I've been told colleagues are sick and tired of seeing high-resolution GC presented to them without any explanation. But then the molecular biologists and the biologists got back at us with genomics. Okay, and so you've got all those genomics slides. Okay, so now that's just 3 examples of how do we put all that data together. Okay, the genomics, the high-resolution GC mass spec, and as Ryan Rogers will point out a little bit later, that's only the beginning, folks. We analytical chemists and geochemists have got some really powerful instrumentation to bring to bear on this. And then you get all of the physical oceanography, really advanced remote sensing, drifters, you name it, and models. And so how do we put all that together? I don't know. It's a good question, but I think it deserves a great deal of attention.
Thank you. Got a couple more questions for you, and this is one we talk about a lot, and I'd like to hear your perspective. But how has the relationship between NERDA and the outside academic community changed through the various oil spills that you have been associated with?
Oh, I think that there's much more, appropriately, we have to pay attention to people in the legal profession. When I came back from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, I wrote to the president of the Academy at the time, who unfortunately has passed away just recently, Frank Press, and said, how come we weren't allowed to see the data? And out of that came a little workshop that the Academy had between the legal community and various scientists. No report, just a discussion. And I'm sorry I can't remember the judge's name from New York, but he was there. He was the first one to actually allow DNA evidence into court cases. And he eloquently pointed out that there are many different ways of approaching the truth. The law had one particular way, and the scientific community had an equally logical different way. But the way things worked is that we had to adhere to the law, and the law was NERDA. But then they began to open that up a little bit, and I think there's quite a bit of conversation going on. And one of the things I forgot to mention, so I'm glad that it's here, and I'm not trying to, give another talk on this, but I was very impressed that after the settlement, that both NERDA and BP made all of their data available. We see publications coming out from our colleagues who worked on NERDA and so forth and so on. And Do I have time to share one joke?
Sure, yeah, we still got,
Okay.
you got 5 minutes, so please take.
So I was up in Alaska in Juneau, and the Outer Continental Shelf Advisory Committee was having a meeting, and it's open to the public. And Craig O'Connor, who was chief counsel of NOAA, was there representing NOAA and NERDA. And he started to make a presentation to the committee, and John Teal, who was the chair of the committee, said, "Oh, Counselor O'Connor, could you explain for the general public what NERDA is?" And without missing a beat, O'Connor said, "Oh, of course, Professor Teal. NERDA is a term we lawyers use to refer to the gathering of scientists that you have here." Okay, I give up.
Good point, well taken. Another question from the audience that says, for your respective ecosystems, and I think we'd probably specify the Falmouth spill as an example because that's your ecosystem, which aspects have not fully recovered and to what extent?
Okay, there's an area of West Falmouth, and large amounts of the marsh in West Falmouth have recovered. There's no doubt about it. And there's a small area that's right adjacent to several homes, and it's their area. And they're not happy that it continues to be contaminated. Just last September, my colleague Chris Reddy, who has been doing wonderful studies, his lab went out there and took another core. And he invited me to come into his lab when they sectioned the core. And from that area, when they got down to the 11 to 15 centimeter range, you didn't have to do any analysis. You could smell the number 2 fuel oil still. Okay. Jennifer Culberson did her dissertation research, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, in the Boston University Marine Program with Ivan Valiella and with Chris Reddy as members of the committee. And she did a wonderful study comparing the control marsh and the West Falmouth marsh. And I'll just give you one example. They looked at fiddler crabs, and the fiddler crab burrows in the West Falmouth oiled area go down like this, about 5-6 centimeters, and then go sideways. And it's replicated. It's not anything that's only a one-place thing. The ones in the Sippy-Wissett control marsh keep going all the way down. The fiddler crabs from the West Falmouth marsh area that are areas that are still oiled, very small area, they have behavioral problems. I won't go on anymore. She did a lot of studies, and it's pretty clear that there are some pretty interesting problems associated with that. And of course, we have the comparison coming up with all the wonderful work that's been going on with the Coastal Waters group here in Consortia, and they've got papers out that show what's going on in the marshes of Louisiana, which is the heritage from Gulfstuff.
Yeah, we'll hear about some of that later today. The last question, and then we'll move on, refers to the moving baseline syndrome. And the question is, can you determine an adequate baseline when the abiotic and biotic environments are constantly changing both slowly and abruptly? The baseline must be a variable-based range.
The baseline is dynamic, and it's good that you've given me the question, but I already gave you the challenge, and so I'll turn it back to you and say, how are we going to do this?
Yep, good response. Well, thank you very much. A round of applause for our speaker.